I always feel like I was listening to a webcast replay. It's funny to me that with webcast replays, when you hear calendar notifications chiming on someone's computer, it's like the Pavlov's bell of the coronavirus era. It makes you think, am I missing a meeting? Am I in the right place? What am I supposed to remember right now? But I'm glad that all of you are with us. You're in the right place.
Perfect. And it is just about time to get started. It's the top of the hour. Hello and welcome to One Quick Thing. I'm Caitlin Milliken, IL's multimedia editor.
And I'm Scott Kirshner, CEO and co-founder of Innovation Leader, and we're really glad you could be with us today.
A quick overview of Innovation Leader before we introduce our featured guest for today. We've created the world's biggest network of innovators who work inside large organizations, and we produce content, research, and gatherings like this one to help them learn from peers and deliver more impact in their organization.
And One Quick Thing is a chance to connect with a group of innovators from around the world. We'll get the conversation warmed up for the first 15 minutes, and then we'll give you 15 minutes to ask questions of your own.
We also should give a big thank you to our sponsor of today's episode, PatSnap.
So PatSnap is an AI solution that collects information from databases around the world, from Asia to Europe, Europe to the US, and everywhere in between, making IP and R&D insights accessible to all. PatSnap helps you make sense of the unknown, turn data into intelligence, and make decisions that shape our world. You can find out more about them at patsnap.com.
Great. Thanks, Scott. If you're a frequent viewer, you might have noticed that I have switched roles for the day. So Scott will be keeping an eye on the chat stream. If you have any questions, advice, or comments, feel free to chat away and we'll try our best to weave those in. And if you want to jump in via video in the second half of the meeting, let us know that in the chat. I'm super excited to have Jodie Brinkerhoff, the VP of Innovation at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, here with us today. The travel sector has had a tough run in 2020, facing both travel restrictions and changes in customer behavior. Now teams have to create an environment that feels safe for passengers. Jodie has been at Dallas-Fort Worth since 2019. Before she was the North American at Mastercard Labs. Jodie, thanks so much for being here today. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to get to chat and see some familiar names on the list. So again, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Big fan of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. I've been there multiple times to visit family. Just to kick us off, a lot has changed in the travel sector this year. What are the top priorities for your team at this point in 2020?
So just to give you a little bit of background, the innovation team at DFW was actually new in 2019. So we started from scratch, and I joined in April of last year, and we subsequently added 2 and 2, and we're up to a team of 9 people. So we were in the process of really starting out and putting a process in place, and DFW Airport's always been very, very innovative. But didn't really have a shared process for delivering those innovations. And as a result, sometimes things, got to a test and didn't have the right parameters in place. And so our job was to come in and put a process in place, and also, well, in doing that, de-risk new product introductions, but also shepherd some of the innovation culture that what they were looking for in building, skill building and things like that. So that continues to be our priority, but obviously in a post-COVID environment, and I would tell you, we were really just having our 1-year anniversary as a team when COVID hit, and the last couple of months have certainly been a whirlwind. Our priorities, aside from the blocking and tackling that had to be done right out of the gates, we shifted some priorities on projects we were working on. We delayed some, we canceled some, unfortunately. But our focus has really been in how do we help the organization rebuild? How do we help the organization from an employee and passenger health and safety perspective? How do we help the organization think about longer term operational and infrastructure resilience? So we've been doing a little bit of everything as a unit that really supports the entire organization.
Great. Before we hopped into this call, you mentioned that your team's approach to the pandemic fell into 3 stages. I'd love if you could sort of fill everyone in on what those are. That would be
Sure. I mean, I think anyone that's gone through this has been through a little bit of an evolution over the course of the last couple of months. And as we got our footing, things start to change. And so when I look back over the last couple of months, I see it in 3 parts, and that is the blocking and tackling. That was right out of the gates. We had an organization that didn't have a work from home policy. We, obviously as an airport, as a highly operationally efficient organization, had lots of emergency plans and such. But by no means did anyone ever think about the possibility of something as long and protracted as this. So the blocking and tackling brought us all together to really just deal with the day-to-day needs. The second part, I would think, and once we got our footing, we shifted into this period that I would refer to as sharpening the focus. That was where we all sort of got our hands on deck and said, okay, what are our roles and how do we ensure that we're not overlapping, that we're collaborating together in a way that takes advantage of the highest and best use of our team's time and talent. And I say that because as a new organization to DFW, my team came from the outside. They had a lot of experience interviewing new technology vendors and such. And the pace at which we could do that was probably faster than and more critical than the pace that perhaps the rest of the organization could operate. So with some very frank conversations we had with our business partners, we defined roles and responsibilities, who's going to do what on certain projects. And then I would say, we shifted into this period of, okay, this is a longer term recovery. How do we plan for the future? And what are the ways that we can build to scale some of these tests and some of these things that, at first seemed like we were going to jump out and do it for a small period of time. But then we began to realize these are going to be longer term things. And we have an opportunity as an organization, we have a responsibility to act differently coming out of this. So that's sort of how I think about it. And our iterative learning and activities have sort of gone along that time period.
Right. So you mentioned sort of looking into the future and preparing for that. Obviously, there are a few different scenarios of how that could play out, depending on how the economy is doing, how a vaccine is distributed, and how quickly that process takes. How is your team approaching that scenario planning element of innovation at Port?
Well, there are 2 parts to it. I think in the beginning of this, when we first started looking at what our role was within the organization, we did a lot of vendor assessments. We were looking for technologies to solve certain problems that were coming up, and they were coming up just by listening to, for those of you that aren't familiar with the environment, in an emergency situation, the airport, in our case, had twice daily emergency calls for months. And every morning they said, oh, your innovation, you don't really need to participate, right? But that was where I got to listen to what was going on at the airport with regard to passengers, cleaning and sanitization, our partnerships with our airline partners like American and TSA. And we started to hear, okay, what are the things surfacing that may be an opportunity for us to jump in and lend a hand? And so there was that. And I would say, my team was really great in that they really had to handle things in fits and starts, right? On one day, it was like, okay, this is what everyone's saying right now, go run and go figure this out. And then maybe there became a reluctance because of policy reasons or what have you. And the technology was there, but the policy and the ecosystem around it wasn't necessarily there. And so, that was the beginning part. But then the organization got to a place where we said, okay, we really do need to do some traditional scenario planning and look at the what if scenarios. What if the industry just bounces right back and we have a continuation? What if the industry is completely transformed? And what does that mean to us? And what if there's an equilibrium where we just level out at a lower number of passengers for a period of time? And then certainly what happens if, everything goes awry, and what would we do as an organization? And so over the course of the last couple of months, we've been partnering with other departments to go through this very in-depth process where we looked at what are the potential impacts to the 24 business units that we have. And in assessing those potential impacts, what are the things that we can do as an organization to countermand some of those things? Like, how do we protect ourselves? How do we insulate ourselves? And a lot of that comes down to thinking about how do we flex a little bit faster than you might expect a government organization to flex? How do we collaborate better? How do we just build that organizational resiliency in terms of the things that we do, but also the way that we work?
Right. I do want to take some of the larger categories we talked about and really put them in the frame of the customer experience. So, some people may not have flown since the pandemic started. How has the experience of being at an airport, both before takeoff and after landing, changed?
Well, I think there'd be a number of things that you discover. I mean, for one, and the most obvious for many people, is that passenger volume is down. I think at our lowest point, the industry was down 95%. At DFW, we're probably back up to 50% of our normal passenger traffic. And that's actually increasing, which is a great thing for all of us. But the safety and sanitization initiatives that have been put in place are front and center. So when you arrive at the airport, you will notice that first and foremost, masks are required. So masks are required now on the airlines, but also at our airport from the minute you walk in the door. So that is something that's very evident to passengers. But you would also notice strike teams out there, sanitization, disinfecting strike teams. As you can imagine, the cleaning and sanitization effort, just disinfecting in particular, went up at the arrival of COVID. I think the airport has always been a very clean place, but the way that you clean is different when there is a virus like this. So you'll see a lot of evidence of those things. And then you'll see an ongoing effort to offer hand sanitizer and make things touchless. I know a lot of our concessionaires have doubled down on QR codes for payments and things like that. So you will really see it throughout the organization in various points of that customer journey, if you will, from curb to gate.
Great. So a lot of the changes that you mentioned had to happen on a shorter time period. Can you share one example of something that you had to pivot and what the story are?
Sure. I fondly will share our experience. So last year, we spent 7 months, almost from the time that I got here, our team was working on putting in place an autonomous vehicle in the spirit of efficient mobility and with a vision of what the impact of autonomous would have for us in the future. And we worked diligently to get that autonomous vehicle up and running by the holidays. And we were 2 months into that pilot, operating in a very large parking lot at DFW. And Katie, you may know, the South parking lot is a giant place, and we were heading into the holidays, and we knew passengers would be coming in with gift bags and children, and we wanted to be able to give them a lift on this autonomous vehicle from the outer parts of the parking lot. And we were so proud to get that thing launched, and we were working great with our partners in parking and planning and all of those things. And unfortunately, when COVID hit and people stopped traveling, the car rentals actually, those cars actually started coming back to the airport in volumes that we weren't used to. And we ended up having to use that parking lot as an overflow lot for the rental cars. And so unfortunately, Emma, our Easy Mile Efficient Mobility shuttle, had to be suspended. So, I mean, that was one of those things that we pivoted. And again, in partnership with our partners that we were working with, we were able to basically save some of the data that we had and the learnings, which it would be hard to believe the amount of learning we got just in the setup period for that. But now we're working with them to determine where else can we put a vehicle, or can we pivot to a different type of vehicle with a vision of efficient mobility 2.0, which still remains really, really important to the airport. And with the planning cycles for infrastructure and such, those are things we need to be thinking about today. Just because COVID hit doesn't mean that that's any further in the future. Our construction cycles and things like that still need to be informed by these strategies. But
thanks for that example. Thanks for that example of a pivot, Jodie. We're already starting to get some questions from our participants, so keep those coming. You can drop your question in the chat window and let us know. We love for people to be on camera to ask their questions, or we can always ask it for you if you don't want to have your camera on. We also have a poll that we're going to launch because I'm curious how all of you have been traveling these last few months since the mid-March period. So you should see a poll window pop up. And we always like to get really good voter turnout for these polls. So if you've hopped into another window, perhaps you're multitasking. I've heard sometimes people do that on Zoom. I'm not really sure if it's true, but look for the poll window and give us your answer. Hey, Katie, maybe since you're the host, I'm not sure if you need to launch that poll, if I'm allowed to do it.
Yep, the poll is live and we have 77% of people voting.
Oh, look at that.
Yes, and while we get those last few folks to cast their votes, I'm going to tell us about our next event. Our team is hosting Impact 2020, our largest event of the year, next week from October 20th through the 23rd. The event is completely online, meaning that we have more speakers and attendees than ever before. This is actually our biggest event of all time. Our speakers come from Converse, Lyft, General Mills, Vertex Pharmaceutical, Bar 3, and NASA, just to name a few. We have tons of other speakers as well from a wide variety of companies. We also have virtual tours of innovation spaces, interactive exercise classes, random and scheduled networking sessions. Everything is designed to be super helpful for innovators navigating 2020. So be sure to join us. It's going to feel as close as an event can to in-person as possible this year. You can register and learn more at innovationleader.com/impact2020. Thanks everyone for listening to that announcement. I'm going to close our poll and share results. We see that it's a good split between people who have taken multiple flights since March, interesting, and people who have not traveled outside of their city since mid-March. So very different ends of the spectrum there. Have any insight, Jodie, in how that lines up with typical customers that your team's been tracking?
No, I mean, it's been interesting because obviously business travel's down, right? People aren't going to the office. There are corporate policies that are restricting business travel. So our customer mix has changed. Our customer experience group is doing a lot of insights work right now to understand what's driving trust and things like that. But we've got more leisure travelers than we normally do. Credit to our partners at American, because of their flight schedules, we actually have a lot more connecting passengers than we might have had before. Again, those volumes are coming back quickly. But we do see, I think, anecdotally, that there's some people that just they're not bothered by the whole thing. They're out there taking advantage of the fact that the flights aren't crowded and all of that. And then you certainly have people that are not, comfortable leaving. And so we're doing a lot right now to try to figure out what drives the trust of the passengers and give us a platform to actually query those people and perhaps prioritize some of the things that we want to be doing. There's a tremendous amount of talk about what it's going to take to rebuild customer trust. And coming from the research world, I sat back and I said, well, are we measuring customer trust and what are we doing about that? And how will we know if we're successful? So we've got some, initiatives underway working with our partners internally and within the industry to try to unlock that and hopefully take advantage of it as an industry group to make everybody out there more aware of what we're doing and more comfortable with the idea of coming back to travel because, people want to get out and see their family members. They want to get out and meet people at industry events like Impact next week, which my team is signed up for. They want to do in-person training, things like that have been on hold for quite some time.
I'd love to come back to that topic of trust, but I also want to weave in some questions. So Vim has a question about brand new innovations that have emerged at DFW rather than accelerating existing innovations. So some examples of stuff that was really sparked by the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, when you say brand new innovations, I mean, having been in this world, you think sort of way far-flung future stuff. And I will tell you, our focus has really largely been on the health and safety of our employees and passengers, and build business resiliency. So naturally, we were working on things like thermal cameras. How do you do temperature testing? But the more you got into that, the more you realize that temperature testing or temperature checking isn't necessarily a silver bullet with regard to passengers with or employees with COVID. So you begin to say, okay, maybe I need to pivot to something else. And obviously, there's talk about COVID testing and immunity wallets and things like that. I would tell you, I think, some of the more meaningful initiatives have come out of partnership with a lot of different departments, not just innovation, but largely focused on customer experience and a health and safety protocol, if you will. And we are definitely looking at things like digital identity to enable some of the touchless experience from curb to gate. But those are all things, and they're all principles that we were focused on before COVID. So everything related to efficient mobility and automation, data-driven decision-making, I'm trying to think, safety and security, and the seamless customer journey. I mean, those principles of focus hold for us despite this pandemic right now.
There was a question also about automatic temperature screening at each entry point at DFW. Is that something you're doing today? And if not, why not?
We're not doing it today. It's interesting. There are a lot of things that pop up that we could do from a technology perspective. But in this environment, with the governance structure of airports and the partnership with the airlines and our partners at TSA, the policy doesn't necessarily get there at the same time. And so part of our role has been to start to evaluate some of these things in advance of the policy getting there. As you can imagine with, we were on track to have 75 million passengers come through this year. We'll probably hit about 45 million. But there are all sorts of policy and privacy decisions that go into that. And the ecosystem is really complex at an airport because of our governance structure and all of the airlines and concessionaires and the federal partners that exist in this ecosystem. So getting everybody on the same page about pursuing some of these technologies is not necessarily the easiest thing, but it's something we're all really talking about and working collectively as an industry to sort out.
I want to get to a question about comparing there's a question now from Raghu about passenger confidence building innovation. And kind of that ties to something I was going to ask you about, which is, you talked about, either proving that you've been tested for COVID or proving you've been vaccinated, kind of this idea that we might have some kind of digital certification. Is that going to be a key part to getting travel really back onto a significant growth trajectory? Or do you feel like, people are traveling today and there's just a mask mandate, and so we may not need these additional layers to kind of get confidence back amongst the mass of people who maybe haven't traveled since March?
So I think that it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. And one of the reasons that we are initiating this body of research that we're doing is to understand what is the customer perspective. And that coupled with the CDC guidelines that we're following and the evolution of technology and potentially a vaccine. I mean, this is going to be a long haul path to recovery, and it's going to be iterative. People's perspectives have changed, I think, since this first came out, and they're evolving over time. And our objective as an organization is going to be to continue to lean into those requirements, but also take advantage of emerging technologies and real voice of customer research to help guide some of the principles and policies that will follow. But it is not a DFW only thing. It is absolutely an ecosystem of partners with airports across the globe, really. But those conversations are happening. So I think there's a real concerted effort and a big muscle behind getting people back on the road again.
So a question earlier, just asking you to compare your experience kind of building the innovation team there at Dallas Fort Worth Airport with your experience at Mastercard Labs. which we've been to in the past and was very focused on like startup engagement, the future of payment, how do you make restaurant purchases, gas station purchases more seamless? How would you, Ron wants to know kind of how you would compare those two cultures or their approaches to innovation.
Well, the one thing I would tell you is that from a business perspective, the Mastercard is a network and deals with hospitality and airlines and restaurants and all things customer experience the very same way that the airport does. The airport is essentially a network of all of these different partners, government policy and regulatory issues and concessions and travel and all those things. So the future of at Mastercard is very similar to the future of as we think about the future of travel. And so there are a lot of parallels. Now, Mastercard has had a labs organization in place for many, many years, and I was able to participate in that in the North American region, working with partners and such. Starting up a program, it's the reason why I came to Dallas. It's really the opportunity of a lifetime. And in partnership with the team and the leadership, we've had a great opportunity to come in and put in place a structured process. And credit to our leadership for believing in that and wanting to pursue additional skill building for all employees around innovation culture and all of that, because I've seen how valuable that can be, in one place. And it's really easy to sort of paint a vision. That the more challenging thing is to execute on it in an environment that is, a very traditional, operationally focused government, quasi-government organization. But so far so good.
And sorry, did I miss this before? How big is the innovation team currently at DFW?
We're a total of 9.
All right.
Yep.
So let's see if we can get one or maybe two last questions here, quick questions and quick answers. Have you learned anything from other COVID successful regions like Asia that you've been able to apply? Vim wants to know, or like, is the culture too different here? And there are some things that you could do in China, Korea, Singapore that are just tough to do in the US.
So obviously those markets are different and the geography is different. So when the country starts shutting down borders, there continues to be a fair amount of travel through DFW because it's within the United States. But one thing that you should know about the airport industry is that there's a lot of collaboration. And so, our teams of executives and such are sitting on these collaborative conversations with other airports in other countries. There's a fair amount of sharing that goes on. I took phone calls early on from partners of ours in Mexico who were saying, travel between Dallas and Mexico is so important. What can we be doing together? Or can I do what you're doing so that there's a consistent customer experience that we can deliver? So there are learnings, but the way that we're governed is very different. And I'm not going to make this a political conversation, but I will tell you, outside of leaning into innovators in other countries, I also want to just make a point that groups like this, where there's a cross-functional set of people who operate in an innovation function or a technology function, those have been really helpful to me, because I found myself in the first couple of weeks on the phone with folks at like Mercedes-Benz Stadium and Colgate. You wouldn't think that there was a synergy between Colgate CPG and DFW Airport, but we were all looking at temperature checking, thermal temperature checking. They were doing it for their factories. We were doing it for our employees and passengers. They were looking at security and UV robots. So they were like, hey, we're looking at these things. You might want to look at these things. And so we were sharing learnings in a way that was really productive, because we were getting bombarded. And, apologies to anyone on the phone that sent me emails that didn't get responded to. But it was really hard to keep up with the influx of inquiries from people that were coming from the market with a new shiny technology, something that was a silver bullet to solve all of our problems at once. And I found those partnerships invaluable to help manage through some of that volume and some of the greater opportunities that existed.
All right. So thanks for that, Jodie. I'm noticing we are just about at the 30-minute mark. So I want to thank everybody for their questions. Jodie, if you can stick around for 5 more minutes, we can sometimes do a little bit of bonus question time. Are you good with that, or do you have a hard stop?
I'm good.
All right, great. So we'll take a couple last questions in that bonus time, but Katie has some quick announcements for now about our next few online events if you have to log off at the half hour.
Yes. So anyone who has to leave at the half hour, I want to mention our new startup demo series, Go for Launch. In each, we have 3 promising startups demo their products in just 30 minutes. The products themselves are ready to go to market and may be relevant to improving processes at your organization. We also throw in some fun ones that can improve your personal lives, like a robot that weeds in your garden, an at-home boxing trainer if you're into the exercise world. You can sign up for that call or see past installments at innovationleader.com/go-for-launch. Our next episode is this Friday. And our impact event is also next week, which I talked about a little bit earlier, and you can sign up for that as well at our website, innovationleader.com/impact2020. All right. So bonus questions. We have another one about pilot testing regarding touchless technology. Can you talk about sort of the testing process that your team does when it comes to bringing new tech in?
Sure. So that's one of the things that our team has done over the course of the last year was to implement what is relatively a stage gate process, taking people through discovery, ideation, concept development, partner and prototyping, business plan, assessments, partner and prototyping, and then eventually to a rollout. So our objective is always to really refine what problem are we trying to solve, and then make sure that we're working cross-functionally to bring in potential solutions that solve that. From a testing perspective, we're a great place to test, right? We've got a lot of customers coming through on any average day. We've got an appetite, through our leadership team to do trialing and testing. That said, we're a quasi-government entity, and so getting some of these things stood up from a procurement perspective can be challenging. But we do very much have a test to learn strategy. In fact, my team has a portfolio that specifically focuses on what we call rapid learning tests, which give us the opportunity to say, these are emerging technologies. We think that this may have an application to the airport, but we don't quite know how big that opportunity is. Let's go get it. Let's bring it in. Let's do a quick test, and then use that as a springboard to introduce the technologies to other business units and start potentially looking at what problems it helps solve. So again, it's not your traditional, let's go figure out the problem and then figure out what emerging technologies exist to solve the problem. It's, hey, we think there's this technology that could help us. Let's go learn.
Great. And I do want to answer one final question from Raghu, who asks, one of the biggest challenges in this pandemic has been lack of consistent and most up-to-date info. Have there been any efforts to funnel any of this information onto platforms at the airport and its airline partners?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that there were twice daily for a while emergency, calls that were happening, and those were cross-functional, and that they had representation from our airline partners as well as our federal agency partners and such. And there was an uptick in communications that were going out. There's been a tremendous amount of effort to ensure that the messages going out to employees at the airport as well as passengers is consistent. That is an art. It really does require good open lines of communication with our partners. And I think if there's upside from all of this, it's that those relationships have gotten more collaborative. They've gotten more consistent. And we recognize that we're all sort of links in this value chain that delivers on a single customer experience. And together with our on-site partners, but as well as the other airports, that's something we really got to think about, because otherwise you have someone who goes on Twitter and says, I was at LaGuardia and this is what happened. I flew through Dallas and this is what happened. I ended up in San Francisco and this is what happened, and what's going on here. So I think there continues to be an opportunity, and one that the industry is taking seriously.
Great. So there's a kind of a last question, which maybe we can tackle quickly because it plugs into that about, wearing of masks in the airport versus on airlines. I think it kind of ties into what you were just saying, which is people's experience is noticing, that one person who doesn't seem to be wearing a mask, or reading online about, the one dust up of somebody who
Right.
doesn't want to wear their mask on a plane. So it almost, there's a question about how do you police mask wearing at the airport, but I also just wonder if there's a bigger question about communicating what's happening in a way that builds trust as opposed to focuses on the exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to human behavior, right? And this notion that you have to do things a certain number of times and it becomes a habit, right? And so I think that consistency, and this is where the conversations between ourselves and American and others, are really important, because again, that choppy customer experience, like if they don't know what to expect and they experience something different throughout their journey, how are they going to learn, right? And so I do believe that consistency in the message is really important. And yes, there are people that are exceptions, either, for one reason or another, and we won't get into why. But we've got to work despite that, and we've got to work together, and we've got to follow the CDC guidelines, and we've got to take voice of customer, into account. And again, the ecosystem that we operate is very complex. And I mean, it's interesting because, again, depending upon where you're coming from, you might have a very different experience that you're bringing to the experience, or background that you're bringing to the experience. So, it just requires continued open dialogue, consistent standards, which the industry is sort of pursuing right now. DFW, the customer experience team, actually went and got GBAC certified, which is a global biorisk initiative, which said we're the first airport to be certified against, these sort of, biorisk hazards. So the more that we can bring consistent experiences to the single passenger, I think the faster we're going to have that chance to rebuild customer trust. But this is definitely a journey. And we're learning a lot as we go.
Do you, maybe before we let you go, do you have a time frame? I mean, it feels like 2021 in whatever industry you're in is going to be kind of the recovery, starting to build the new normal, build that trust, have an experience that you may not have had in 2020 in terms of travel. Do you talk about the return to normal, and that's a thing we talk about in 2022, or do you not put a date on sort of that, post-vaccine, kind of post-COVID era?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something we've been talking about since the beginning, right? And it's one of the reasons why we were inspired to do scenario planning, because the path forward was really uncertain. And we knew, based on all the research that we were grabbing from all over, that things like a vaccine were at the top of the list in terms of people's willingness to go back to an airport or get on a plane. And we don't know when that's going to be. We do know, as a government entity, we know that it takes time. And so we really needed to focus on planning for whatever the outcomes of that might be. The projections right now have us returning to, pre-COVID levels, I think by 2022, 2023. And, do I think that shifts? Sure. But we're going to continue to put practices in place that go to rebuilding confidence, making people feel safe and secure. That's always been a core foundation and pillar of our airport. Delivering a good customer experience, that's always been a foundational element of what we're doing. And we will continue to work with our partners. Yeah, I mean, the work continues. But we're prepared, and we're becoming more resilient as we really have these open dialogues about what could we do to unlock superpowers, if you will, and how do we combat some of the uncertainties that are inevitably going to exist for months to come.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, for you, that return to normal is kind of a return to a certain volume of passengers, even though there could be sort of precautions and safety practices and screening practices that may not feel like the normal of the before times of, January of 2020, right?
But it's interesting you bring it up, because when we went through this exercise of saying, what are the things that drive our business? Passenger volume is obviously one that comes up again and again and again. But through this exercise, we started to look at what are the other indicators that we should be looking at. And, I mean, something as crazy as the sales of chewing gum, have an impact on customer confidence. And so it's why we've sort of gone forward and invested in this data-driven decision-making initiative around customer trust, because we want to have some mechanism to prioritize activities and then track how it's going. Anyway.
That's cool. I am glad we were able to spend a little bonus time here taking some additional questions. We're so grateful for your time today. I know we're going to see some DFW people at the Impact Conference next week. Vim says he likes your background. I'm curious, is that your photo or is that a shared photo of a?
No, I've got to be honest. I got this from one of my friends in America, and we were on a meeting one night, and I had a DFW landscape, and he pointed out that there was not an American tail in the picture. And so I quickly offered to use his background. So, I figure if I can't travel, or if I'm going to be in the hot seat today on one quick thing, I might as well be in business class, right?
Awesome. We love it. So thanks for the time, everybody. Great to hear your questions and see all of you online. Hopefully you have a great rest of the week. Thanks, Jodie. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.